The appeal to rights. Many people, especially those in Western-style democracies, believe in rights. It is often accepted that people have rights that protect them and even entitle them to certain things. It is generally accepted that such rights must be respected under most conditions. This particular method involves assessing an action, policy, etc. in terms of whether it is in accord with such rights. This method is based on what's known as rights theory, the view that people, and perhaps other beings, have moral rights. Thinkers such as John Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes have put forth theories of rights. While rights theories have a great deal of appeal, they're also subject to criticism. There are numerous criticisms of particular rights theories, as well as rights theories in general. While they often overlap, it is important not to confuse moral rights with legal rights. Law and morality are distinct areas, although arguments can be made that link moral rights and legal rights. In order to do this properly, the method of mixing norms can be employed. Now there are two variations on this method. Each one is 3 steps. Method 1. Step 1. Argue for right Y, whatever the right is. Step 2. Argue that X violates or does not violate right Y. Step 3. Conclude that X is not morally acceptable or alternatively is acceptable. The second method is to argue for obligations. Step 1. Argue for right Y. Step 2. Argue that X is required by right Y. Step 3. Conclude that X is morally obligatory. This method generally requires providing the audience with a reason, that is to say, an argument, that supports the right. In some cases, this might involve using another method or a moral theory. One way to argue for a right is to use an existing moral theory that argues for the right that is needed. For example, an argument involving a right to liberty can be based on John Locke's theory. Another way to do this is to use a right that has been established in another area, such as law, and then use mixing norms to argue that it should be a moral right as well. For example, one might argue from the legal right of a free press, as presented in the Bill of Rights, to a moral right against censorship. As an example, censorship has often been proposed to protect people from the alleged harms of violent and sexually explicit media. Censorship of this sort can be argued against by contending that people have a right to freedom of expression. If this right can be established, it can be concluded that such censorship is not acceptable. Now suppose you're on the receiving end of an appeal to rights, or, in the context of the paper, you wish to raise an objection against your own appeal to rights and then reply to it. There are a variety of ways to respond to this method. The first is to argue against there being such a right by arguing that the right is simply not a valid right. Alternatively, it can be argued that the right is incorrectly applied. If the right is successfully attacked, then the argument, the method, is undercut. This type of attack will vary depending on the right and the circumstances. It might be argued that the right is not a legitimate right. For example, if someone makes an argument based on an alleged right granting total freedom of expression, then this could be easily countered by arguing there is no such total right. People, for example, do not have the right to yell fire when there is no fire in a crowded theater. It might also be argued that a more important right overrides the right in question. For example, someone might argue against abortion rights by arguing that the right to make choices is overridden by the right to life. A second way to reply is to make use of an appeal to consequences. In this approach, it would be argued that the consequences morally override the right. For example, consider the matter of censorship. While it is generally accepted that people have a right to free expression, It is also accepted that this right is not absolute. A person has no right to slander another person. While censorship would run against the right of free expression, the harms produced by certain works could be taken to justify censoring them, just as it would be justified to quiet a person yelling fire in a crowded but fire-free theater, or by preventing someone from publishing malicious lies and slander. A third way of replying is to use an appeal to rules method. It could be argued that a moral rule overrides the right in question. For example, people are supposed to have a right to life and property, but it could be argued that they can be justly deprived of them by a rule involving proper punishment. And a fourth way, of course, includes all the other ways of arguing against an appeal to right, perhaps some other method, as discussed in the methods in this class, or some other means of countering it. And that brings us to the end of appeal to rights.